the plaza with uplighters near stone columns and huge sculpture trees to give just a minute.
Uh, I think we lost Prachi here. Prachi, are you there online still? Prachita, sorry. Prachita,
She's just coming, yeah. She just, I think she got disconnected. I've just allowed her.
Sure.
Prachita, unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, I am done, ma'am. So I'll just wrap it up and conclude by saying that, to conclude, I'd like to say protected monuments like Qutub Minar are closely associated with the ridge, the existing water system, forest, and open space network. They exemplify the traditional link between natural and cultural resources, which needs to be enhanced and strengthened in order to improve Delhi's environment. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Prachita. And I think your entire thesis was quite methodical and very well articulated. There were a lot of things that you talked about, from planting strategy to smaller nuances, which was quite interesting. What I really liked is you brought an aesthetic sensitivity as well, to a degree, to what is heritage and culture and ecology coming together.
Yeah.
So that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank
you. We now move to our last presenter, Prasanna Matiko. Prasanna is a landscape architect graduated from SET. His thesis is titled Reimagining the Grid, a Biophilic Neighborhood. Prasanna, to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Shantesh. I'll just share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, but we see sort of split screen. Yeah, now it's perfect.
Yeah. So the title of my thesis is Reimagining the Grid, a Biophilic Neighborhood, which forms a part of the larger umbrella that is seeding streets. To begin with, as I mentioned about seeding streets, the first thing that I started doing was understanding the morphology and the growth pattern of the city Belgaum, which is my hometown, located in North Karnataka and at the borders of Maharashtra and Goa. So basically, the growth of the city shows a prominent nature or the pattern towards the NH4 highway that cuts through the city, and also the roads that lead towards Goa and the other coastal parts of Karnataka. So the growth is happening in those directions. And broadly, the typology of streets in Belgaum range from organic, which is the core city, the grid and service lanes, to the pattern and scheme layouts, which are kind of the newer parts of the city. Further, the study area that I am looking at.
I just request others to please be on mute.
Yeah, so the study area that I am looking at is a neighborhood located in this area in context of the city, which is called as the Clockwork Neighborhood. That falls under the second category, second typology of streets, that is grids with service lanes. Now, this particular neighborhood has a brief history of being a part of the British era, as the cantonment setup happened in Belgaum in around 1832. So the historic events led to a plague that struck Belgaum in 1898, and that's when people shifted from the core city towards the extension, and that's when this particular grid patterned neighborhood came into picture because of hygiene constraints and having gaps between houses. So the earlier setting of the whole neighborhood was something like that, where the bungalows were hidden inside foliages of big trees, while today it is growing into a very dense urban fabrics of apartments. There are some glimpses of how the streets are right now, where you can see that the main street is hardly 6.5 meters of carriageway, even the transfer streets, and the service lanes are around 4.5 meters in width. And today they are abandoned because people have disconnected totally with them because of several reasons. The demographics of this particular neighborhood is such that people here maximum work in job profiles from 9 to 5, and most of them are in teaching sector. That's why they have a very typical routine, and a lot of time is spent on streets in the evening. Also, the physical layers show that the neighborhood is bound by a connective road from all the four sides, while a railway track cuts through the center of it. Here you can see that the orange lines are the main streets, and parallel to each orange line, there's a service street forming a mesh inside the neighborhood. The open spaces are such that they're equidistant from each other. These two, the lighter browns are the gardens, while the darker browns are the grounds, which people effectively use even today. That's the Vaccine Institute, again established by the British, which is currently an restricted forest in the middle of the town, adjoining the neighborhood. So the growth impact is such that you can see here that in 2000 versus 2020, where the number of bungalows have been transformed into apartments, and all of this kind of has hampered the way the service lanes are functioning. So the pressure of people coming in, and then lack of civic activities and lack of parking, lack of garbage disposal, all of this pressure is kind of going on the service lanes today. Also, the utility of service lanes has changed. As in the earlier days, these were used for several reasons, like they were a part of daily chores. Then there were grazing happening there. There were buffaloes and cows moving in the service streets. Also, the permeable surface allowed water to percolate. But today, after the smart city proposal implementation, they have been concretized. And today there is just garbage that has been dumped there. And because of the concrete surface, there are floods that happen during monsoon. And eventually they have turned into antisocial activity breeding grounds. Also, the whole aspect has changed the hydrology of the neighborhood, because once upon a time there was one family occupying one plot using the groundwater. Today there are 20 families occupying the same plot using the same amount of groundwater and creating a pressure. Also, the mixed use has hampered the way the drainage systems were, impuring the soil, and that's how even the groundwater is kind of contaminated. The smart city proposals have also displaced the informal economy, where the grocers used to sit once upon a time is being transformed into a vehicular street. And that's how people pull out more vehicles to go even for shorter distances. That has created more chaos over the small width streets. Activities of youngsters and elders revolve around moving in and out of the neighborhood towards Vaccine Depot for morning and evening walks and jogging activities, while elderly people move into the parks, and they also accompany their grandchildren for a walk and for them carry them to play and things like that. The vehicular movement in the neighborhood is such that it is mostly on the periphery, and the internal mesh is used by the dwellers of this particular neighborhood because it is a destination network of streets. This was a very quick study that I did to understand how people behave with these streets. So following one of the elderly person who walked along the street, and at the junction of the service lane, he happened to talk to a guy, but the moment they observed that there was garbage put over, they hopped to the other side of the street. And as he moved further to the junction where the main streets crossed, there were cars moving by. So that was a very uncomfortable place for them to actually stand and talk. So that's how he went on moving further. Similarly, the kids who were riding bicycles at a very random loop were almost going to bump into a car, but that seemed to be a very regular routine for them, which is hazardous in a way. A mid-aged couple was walking along the street, but found it very, very difficult to associate with groups who were talking, and they wanted to be a part of it. But again, because of the movement of vehicles around him, it was not comfortable enough. So with this brief analysis, what I inferred that the scenario earlier versus scenario current. So earlier people used to talk across streets, but today they have isolated themselves. They don't interact with the service lanes at all. Scenario on the main street is such that because of the change level, people also there are more cars being parked over here. So there is lack of interaction that happens across these streets. So the broader inferences are that bulk public space lying in social stigma in the case of service lanes, exploded growth and depleting resource, incompatible organization along the main streets because of the width and all the activities happening within that stretch itself, and lastly, the fragmented ecology. So the broader vision for the whole project is that to address growth and create a walkable neighborhood, eradicate the social stigma of service lanes and use them as multifaceted connectors. Also entirely connect the neighborhood with this historically and ecologically vibrant Vaccine Depot. So in general, crafting public realm, promoting walkability, treating the residual spaces, and eradicating social stigma is the broad vision of the project. So in this idea, I tried to come up with strategies for the same in form of anchors and outcomes. So broadly talking, this is the whole neighborhood out of which I'm studying this part, which forms around 62.9 acres. Within that, 16.8 acres are the main streets. and 0.45 acres is the service street. So it's currently it's 0.45 acres of land which is lying in social stigma, unattended and abandoned. So the root cause of social stigma is very broadly the trash that people go and drop there. Now that is again because public civic bodies are not able to pick up trash on time, and people cannot pile it up at homes. That's why they go and throw it there. A lack of facilities like toilets, especially when there are old people who are diabetic who need to use washrooms regularly at shorter spans, that is not available, and more cars coming into the picture. So all this has kind of hampered the way the service lanes were used. So in this regard, the strategy one is introducing composting systems at regular intervals. So the outcome of this would be once the garbage is put into composting systems, people would start opening up their backyards. There would be more interaction and more eyes on the streets. Second strategy is introducing passive connectors. So wherever there are apartments that have come up, there could be a connector from those apartments, because most of the apartments have a public land use on the ground floor, which either it's a shop or it's a parking. So people can connect through it. And this loop would promote walkability because people can use walking as an option even when it is an emergency or they have to walk fast to the other end of the neighborhood. Introducing public-private interface. So here, some of the old bungalows have only two old couple staying, whose children stay elsewhere. So it's very difficult for them to actually maintain the whole property. So in this case, introducing a public-private interface could also help them maintain. That would create bonding between youngsters and elders from the neighborhood. Eventually, if there are things like urban farms or urban forest, that would create cycles like sowing, harvesting, and composting within the neighborhood that would drift towards sustainability. Lastly, in extending the forest into the neighborhood in forms of orchards, raised bed gardens, and rain gardens. Coming to the main street, so this is how the movement of vehicles happened, say 50 to 60 years ago, where there were ambassador cars and people used cycles and most of them walked. But today, this whole mesh of streets is used by all sorts of vehicles of different dimensions. There are people who walk slowly, people who walk fast. So all of them are currently using all the streets. So the first strategy here is channelizing vehicular movement, and the outcome would be where we can reclaim a lot of space across the streets for people and create safer closures for them. Reclaiming streets for people completely. So where are these segments? If you can see my cursor, most of the properties are opening up on these streets. There are many few properties which open up on this street. So these segments can be completely reclaimed and made into public spaces, where again, getting back the culture of people or the kids playing cricket on streets, or kids playing various activities on the streets. There could be inlays on the streets where small children can actually play with their dices on the street. So these were the strategies for the main street. The possibilities were of how to craft a grazing corridor, because this was the area where the milkman community stays. And earlier they allowed cows to move into it, but since they fear that cow would eat plastic in the current situation because of garbage dumping, they don't take cows from there. Instead, they take them from the main road to Accent Depot for grazing. So I would kind of reintroduce this grazing corridor within the neighborhood and bring them back here in case. So the keystone strategies form to be Main Street, where complete reclamation will happen. One-way street where partial reclamation will happen, which is a shared street, and service street is more of humanization. That would be a composite street. So the current streets condition is somewhat like this, where it is all chaotic in the main street, and this is just abandoned. While once it is kind of ideated and resolved, this would how the organization would look like, where there would be organized spaces, and they would be kind of segregated in a way that they become safe habitats for people to move. So this is an overall schematic master plan where you can see that these are the green parts where the PPP can happen. And the pink line, which you can see, the rectangle, is the area that I have further developed into a detailed plan. So overall, the completely reclaimed street would kind of appear like this. The partial reclaimed street would end up being like this, where we have broader footpaths, and that creates a seamless experience of a shared street. And the service street would end up being more lively and active in comparison with today. So while talking about the ideations, here I also thought of having a people's choice approach, where there will be a choice and rule method. So when I'm talking about treatment of service lanes, well, I'll be introducing trees, rain gardens, etc. So the rule would be people would be able to choose what they want, while the rule states that every street will have at least 2 gardens to percolate water inside the ground and bioremediate it and raise the groundwater in some way. The public-private partnership would involve urban farms, floriculture, urban forests. So now the rule here is that every street should at least have one urban farm and an orchard to create that sustainable cycle. Composting systems would simply mean that wet waste should be sorted off in the neighborhood itself. So based on this, I came up with a kit of parts, like how the combination can happen. So when there is a urban forest, what kind of a low ground cover could come up here, where it would not allow. So for example, if it's a farm, that would not allow the rodents to enter and destroy the farms and stuff like that. When it's like a edge treatment, creating porous openings so that people don't feel safe to walk through these areas, etc. So this is the overall design mosaic of how this kit of parts would be placed in the entire neighborhood. Then coming to elements of directionality, since it's a street intervention, these elements would act like signages in itself also. So bringing back some of the old elements like locally the seater, which is locally called as par. So these pars were there in the neighborhood at different scales once upon a time, which were lost over the period of time. So bringing them back can help people reminisce the origin of this particular neighborhood. Also, the element, the water tub, which is locally called as doni, used to be an element in the streets, in the front yards of these houses. So bringing back those elements can act like signages. Introducing tree markers, that is the Ashwatkate, at the back entrances of houses, and where people can choose what kind of tree they want. That can create a sense of identity and belonging for people to actually appreciate and acknowledge what they have within. And the element Mandav, that creates a buffer and a sense of privacy when people walk in the service lanes. So that's the map which shows where all these elements will be placed in the neighborhood. Based on that, coming to the detailed plan, so these were the two existing re-entries, and the pars were aligned, the seaters were aligned in using those particular trees to create that very much sense of a reminiscing plaza. And then this moves down into the streets on either side. So here the street is divided into two parts, where a person who is tend to walking fast can use this particular stretch, while a person who is leisurely loitering can use this and sit wherever leisurely they feel like sitting. So the par would look somewhat like that, and the street character would somewhat be like this, as you can see in the images. This part is the partially reclaimed street, as you can see in the key plan. So here each entrance is designed with a different kind of a flooring material, where people can actually congregate at these particular junctions. They can bring out their chairs, or they can just stand here in a closure, and that would create safety. So people can from these houses, they can choose what they would want outside the houses, like say for example orchards, or it would be just a seating, or it would be a stretch of rain garden. So that's again a choice that they have. Lastly, coming to the service street. So this is the connector that I was talking. This is an apartment, and that's how you connect to come back to the service street. And again, here there are pause points, and you can see these signages which guide people. So wherever there is a blank wall, there can be a seating area that can be formed. And wherever there are there's a window or something there can be Mandav which deliberates it from and provides a privacy. So these are the orchards and urban farms which are under PPP that you can see here, which are reclaimed in on a contract based kind of thing. Coming to the material, so material talks about mending the shift and crafting identity. So as I was talking earlier about reminiscing, so basalt and laterite were the stones which were extensively used in this neighborhood. So bringing them back kind of helps people to reminisce the whole origin of this particular neighborhood. And also they kind of help in creating microclimates and creating identities to the streets. The planting material also talks about how cycles can be generated. So these are some of the evident species in vaccine depot. So to bring or to cater to birds, we would start from insects, and what would bring in more insects, what would bring in more butterflies, and then they would feed on them, and then there would be more birds into this area. So those kind of cycles were thought of, and this is how the entire the prototype of the neighborhood would working. So the main street, which actually has existing trees, can be a functional landscape. The street which has openings of the house can be aesthetical landscapes, where the trees which bloom or they have fragrance can be used, while the service streets acts like a productive landscape. So all of this kind of establish interdependencies between each other, and each one caters to a component of the cycle, and eventually it forms a microhabitat. Also, people can relate with the landscapes in such that cohabitation, where they are staying with landscape around them, functionality of course, each street can have its own identity, and lastly, productivity. Even people can be a part of this biodiversity or enhancement of biophilia by using artificial nesting grounds for solitary bees and insects. And they can actually have a track of which kind of nest works best. So within 8 months or 1 year, they can replace the nest based on what were their observations. So this volunteering will can also help in creating an awareness about the whole idea of biophilia. Lastly, seasonality, how this would kind of work in terms of one season takes over the other. So simply talking about the service lanes where the creepers can be taken over by cosmos plants, and then that takes over by the Mirabilis jalipa in summer. So there is this constant cycle that happens, which doesn't require a lot of maintenance since this is a public realm. Similarly, with the main streets as well as the partially reclaimed streets, where the leaf or the flower that shed on the floors can create different textures on the grounds, and people would start relating to it largely. At the end, this would be a diagrammatic representation of what will happen to the neighborhood. Like there would be a lot of biophilia engagement within the neighborhood, promoted walkability, and community engagement that again I was explaining about how sustainability can be achieved from these ideas. So this is the diagrammatic representation of the detail part, which talks about reminiscence, also about safe environments and about enhancing the biophilia within the neighborhood at a micro and a meso scale. So lastly, what I achieve is more eyes on the streets, safer environments, and active utilization of public space at service streets. At partially reclaimed streets, I will have shared street experience and safer walkable loops. And at completely reclaimed streets, I will have promoted walkability, reactivated socially-able streets, and discouraged vehicular movement. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Prasanna. I'm just stopping the timer first. Yeah, you were perfectly in time. So thank you so much for maintaining that. What I felt was that there was a thorough inquiry. It was the thesis started with mapping of city history, evolution, planning strategies that have evolved through time, and even human experiences, in fact, which is quite neglected a lot of times. And what I felt is that led to actually crafting of different spatial characters. So that was very interesting. Thank you, all the three. Sorry, just bear with me for a second. Yeah. Thank you all the three participants for presenting. And I was wondering actually at the beginning of this session, which is landscape revival, how would this pan out? Because if it's landscape revival, is it only going to be spatial or sort of? And it just reminded me of the three ecologies by Felix Guattari, where he talks about mental, social, and environmental different ecologies that we play with. In case of Abhinaya, I was just looking and observing that there is social revival and ecological revival that she touched upon. And Prachita touched upon historical or heritage revival and spatial revival. And in case of Prasanna, it was perhaps cultural revival and a revival in the planning of a neighborhood. So there were so many facets which sort of opened up, and I think that starts opening up much more dialogue, and it would be very cohesive in terms of looking at these different characters of landscape within the revival of landscape. With that, I request the panel members, Mangesh and Saurabh, to switch on your cameras. Abhinaya is here online. Prasanna and Prachita, are you online? Oh yeah, you are. Somehow you've moved below. So all of you, if you can switch on the camera. Yeah, Saurabh is logged in from two devices. I hope your mic is working fine.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's start with both of you. You have any specific questions or general observations, what you would like to make? Mangesh, with you.
Yeah, let's start with Mangesh.
Yeah, can I come in?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for inviting me here for this wonderful panel. And I can see that, the kind of issues which are getting addressed in all three projects or all three different thesis, projects, it never looked like I was, looking at three different projects. It's the kind of process which has gone into the entire strategy making which is involved, and which runs between landscape planning and landscape architecture. The kind of thought process which has gone into is very interesting. I must congratulate Abhinay, Prachita, and Prasanna for putting up, a lot of work which speaks of, not only your thesis, but your intentions towards, the way forward, landscape strategies you should have for something like this. I mean, it's quite interesting to see that. Uh, in case of, the three projects, I saw that, initially we saw with Abhinaya, multi-dimensional issues, linked to landscapes, very strategically superimposed over your plans, and how socio-cultural context of the place, contribute to making of a landscape strategy plan or a landscape plan. In the second project, when we saw the area around Qutub Minar with Prashita, tremendous sensitivity towards heritage and historical connections of the past, provoked you basically to get into landscape strategies that tourism component dictated, unlike the first one. And in the last one, when we had this, thing from reimagining the grid, it was quite interesting to see how he interprets the grid, or how he defines the grid, and how he looks at the grid in today's date compared to the past and the present and the future. This reimagining the grid is a very interesting network which connects the entire design process. So all said and done, all three, I must once again, heads off to you all for putting up a wonderful presentation on all these three. What I look at, all these three projects, if I just have a couple of minutes more, Shantesh. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You have.
Yeah. So in all three projects, what I saw was, it's like a tutorial for us. It's like a tutorial which, will be like a stepping stone now to go towards our building, our architectural practice or landscape architectural practice that exists in the industry, and what are the challenges available in front of you to convert this or to translate this into an implementation plan. There are a lot of challenges which come when we translate our design ideas into the building industry, and that's the kind of tutorial which you must use in terms of educating or letting people know what landscape architecture or what landscape profession is. You very rightly, all three of you are trying to address, three key strategic, points in this, where you are educating the architects and allied consultants. You're also educating the stakeholders who are involved into policy making and policy decision making, stakeholders. And also you are addressing issues linked to the masses. So basically you're not stopping at your thesis level here by just getting some, grades and things like that, but you're translating your design issues and policies to the industry. So like in terms of, the first thesis, it's very rightly named Reviving Forgotten Grounds, and it's actually the reality of the building industry, where in landscape or in landscape profession, the multi-dimensional layers that you have addressed, which are coming from, things like the water systems, the agriculture, education, diverse cultures, are not somehow getting translated. And that's a very good observation that you came up with. So how your multi-dimensional layers basically need to be superimposed over this entire process, whether it's a physical plan in terms of town planning, where both urban and rural sector, or the layers of socio-cultural identities, or terms of, the green reservoirs which are coming over your towns, then correlation with the land uses. Why not landscape strategy dictates a land use plan rather than a landscape master plan or landscape user plan, basically trying to indicate where should be the fill in the blanks of greens in the industry. Then you very rightly spoke about the built and the natural environment. What is your role as we as landscape architects? It's very nicely portrayed. Also, you spoke about, the varied 3 or 4 spaces unlike others where they are compartments. The regulations dictates the green reservoirs of 15% in any town. But in your case, it was integral part of village hamlet or a town hamlet. It was just merging. They were not gated communities kind of thing. So there we as landscape architects have another challenge in terms of how you'll handle this. So it's quite interesting the way you have handled this entire exercise in terms of getting community involved with, landscape master plans. Regarding the Qutub Minar complex, it reminds me of Professor late Mohammad Shahir. He always provoked us to basically, think about 6 elements into our design process, where our entire landscape master plans or making of a landscape master plan revolved around a framework which included user groups, spaces, linkages, circulation, and treatment. And all this is almost common across the world globally. But there's one component which makes it different from Belgium to Tamil Nadu to Delhi, wherever. It's the symbolism. And that is where, Prachita, you can stress upon your particular interventions in this exercise, where we as landscape architects have to highlight the kind of symbolic identity which is there into our projects. Right, you walk into a landscape style, into entire historic character of the past of last 1,000 years, you'll realize that you walk into maybe Lal Killa, from public to semi-public to private. There is a typology which dictates your master plan, right? Same way in case of Qutub Minar, try and dig. What was the intention of the storyline in the past around Qutub Minar, and then maybe automatically you'll realize that symbolic identity is giving you a direction to do something in your landscape plan. And that is one of the biggest strengths you have into this particular contextual based area pieces that you are doing. No doubt heritage, historical, you have respected very well, but maybe we as landscape architects have to touch upon this point. I'm repeating, Professor Shahir always provoked us in basically getting that symbolic identity out into such kind of projects, which is our biggest strength in the entire Asian subcontinent, right? And regarding the third thesis, which was on reimagining the grid, he has very rightly given, the entire evolution from organic components of the past up to the pattern schemes in today's date. But there are challenges in today's date to make it happen. So maybe, Prasanna, you can try to see that through this, when you come towards your implementation plan, you can have multiple dimensions to what a grid is or how it could be interpreted in today's date. Unlike the vernacular practices of building industry of the past, in today's date, it is the app-based technology or app-based automation systems, or the so-called smart city, the wave which is happening across the country, that maybe dictates the kind of grid that you want to do in today's date. So amalgamation of the past and the present in terms of what kind of grid you should have, that's one of the biggest challenge we as landscape architects have. Let not infrastructure of landscape come and dictate to you how the grid should be. You follow the other vice versa pattern, which you have rightly done. And this has to reach our policy makers in the industry today, that the grid definition is completely different. It is not the sewer line, it is not the plumbing line or the grid of the solar should dictate the landscape plan, and we'll end up doing fill in the blanks of greens, right? So I think it's very well interesting situation that you have in front of your things here. Like, I think all 3 thesis projects, when you're leading towards the future, you should always look at the law of the land in terms of regulations, the NBC guidelines. They right now dictate an infrastructural network over your projects. Of course, landscape character and all that is fine. Hierarchy of interface between what happens along the ground floor, what happens along the roofscapes of building is always there. But we as landscape architects must understand the vertical, vocabulary and the horizontal vocabulary. You are in Belgium in this thesis. So is there in your material palette, you spoke very highly about a material palette. So the material palette in Navi Mumbai, material palette in Northeast, a material palette in backwaters of Kerala will completely speak of a complete different design language. So are we as landscape architects, able to reach to the masses and the policy makers and make them understand, or it is just fill in the blanks with hatch patterns on a design, that happens at mostly corporation level. So start looking at those kind of issues in this. It's a very good, interesting streetscape pattern that you have identified into your entire exercise. Also, you had a hidden layer of seasons, you had a hidden layer of biodiversity, which is there even in Prachita's, urban ecology that we spoke of. Overall, huge response in terms of climate responsive landscapes that you have created. I'm very happy with the kind of strength which you have created. And lastly, please, let's look at the human component in our landscapes, not only the greens. Let's not stop at that. It's the human component and the health around. Post pandemics 2020, the newer normal styles are coming up. And that poses new challenges to we as landscape architects. So let's take this further, by consolidating all these projects that you have highlighted as a thought process. It has given a lot to rest of India, whoever is listening to this, as how the entire landscape planning on one side and landscape architecture on the other side poses newer challenges to make our landscape strategies and landscape designs for our industry and our profession. Let's take this further and wish you all the best in profession. And thank you, Santesh, for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mangesh. Before I move forward, amongst our audience, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, thoughts that you would like to share, I request you to put that into the chat box and I'll try to touch if time permits. Over to you, Saurabh.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Right. Thank you so much. I have to thank everyone at ISOLA Bangalore for this wonderful opportunity. It's been very enriching to watch these three presentations. There has been a lot to learn and I've refreshed myself. I also come away from these three presentations with a sense that that the fresh graduates, they are seized of the kinds of themes that are present amongst us, and I'm very happy for the choice of topics and also for the kind of conviction that they've shown in taking these topics forward. So I hope that we will see more such theses in the future, where they're contemporary themes, they're important themes, they're also very complex themes, and I'll touch upon that in a bit. I particularly enjoyed Abhinaya's presentation, also because her thesis, I felt, moves at different levels. So the first level, of course, is that she's addressing the problem of perhaps a neglected part of her city, as do the other two, Prachita and Prasanna. But she does it with a degree of empathy, which is remarkable. And I felt that when I recall her drawings, I looked at her drawings, I was really taken by the kind of by the soft quality of her drawings. And as you also mentioned, Shantesh, that it has a fascinating grain. I also felt that if I were to speak of the design of her design approach, it was soft and it was understated. And I think that that's a very good quality. So Abhinaya, I really enjoyed your drawings also because in terms of their design, they were a little understated, and they permitted things to happen rather than force a solution. I also very much enjoyed the fact that you touched upon two themes which are very interesting to me. The first one is the notion of commons. And commons is a hugely neglected theme in our cities today. It's almost like we've forgotten what living in a city is about. So the first principle of living in a city, actually, as it is, there's a lot of echo. I'm wondering if it is.
I request if anybody is on unmute. Dilip, if you could put others on mute.
Thank you. So, the notion of commons is a very important notion. And it stems actually from the idea of sharing. And a city is actually nothing if it isn't sharing. And to be able to share, first one must learn to give. We must also, there's a notion of living together, of cohabitation. And that leads to then the notion of citizenship. What is citizenship? And citizenship is actually participation. It's actually getting to know each other. It's actually getting along with people who are unlike us. So the choice of your community, the choice of your location, the choice of your neighborhood, the choice of the fact that there are diverse, sometimes conflicting perhaps, histories sitting side by side, cheek by jowl, is actually a fascinating subject, because it is a subject that cuts to the heart of what landscape is. So if you refer to Jeffrey Sachs, if you refer to what has now become a very important concept called the landscape approach. The landscape approach is actually a multidisciplinary approach which is practiced outside landscape architecture. And in fact, very few landscape architects have graduated to practicing the landscape approach, but it's a practice that has come from other disciplines such as sociology and natural resources management, which is actually a process where the term landscape is seen, and the landscape approach is actually a system, is a way of resolving conflicts, resolving differences, is reaching across to contested claims and trying to resolve those claims, because it is because landscapes do not divide. Landscapes are essentially constructs of continuity. So when we speak about confluence, confluence here is a spatial analogy to the philosophical concept of dialectics, which is actually a unity amongst opposites, amongst difference. So the differences, but one not having, not being, not this, is actually only definable if you against the other. So the poles, so there can't be a North Pole without a South Pole, right? So this concept of dialectics is brought into your thesis through the idea of confluence. I read it in this way. And this becomes a very important spatial analogy to attempt to address, to approach those very complex problems which undergird, underwire our cities. Across our cities today, what is in crisis? Commons are in crisis. We know commons are in crisis. But why are they in crisis? They're in crisis because we've forgotten this idea of sharing. We've forgotten this idea of that this new way of building.
Saurabh, are you online?
We lost him.
Hello? Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, there was a power cut, so we lost. So this a new way of building cities. So while we're in this whole rush towards urbanization, and our cities are growing at a phenomenal pace. Our cities are growing at the fastest rate, perhaps anywhere else in the globe, for the last 70 years. And we all recognize that our cities, are face many problems, but essentially, in my opinion, all those problems can be traced back to one root, and that root is a crisis of citizenship, crisis of the kind of institutions that we need going forward, because the institutions that have been very useful to us in the past may no longer work when we're talking about communities, and we're talking about notions of communities such as virtual communities, which are so different from the communities of the past. So with that, I'll stop here with that. But I think that this is a theme that cuts across all three theses, and that was very satisfying to me because it did it in different ways. And while Abhinay's and Prasanna's were more directly on this point of sharing space, shared space, Prachita's was also on, but it was more of a reclaiming of city making, a reclaiming of of urban placemaking from the vagaries and from the sort of abuse of infrastructure planning. So I'm very happy that we are seeing 3 young people who have the courage to to buck the trend and to say that to be able to say to the infrastructure planners that our knowledge put in the service of something only that is only utilitarian will only lead us astray. And so you have recovered that knowledge, you've recovered your your discipline, and you put it in the service of actually, I feel, citizenship. And to me, that's a huge strength of your thesis. And it doesn't matter if there could be I'm sure that going forward 5 years later, 10 years later, when you look back at your own work, you'll say that there were things I could have done differently. I could have this part is a little weak. And so
I think we lost him again. Just wait for about 5-10 seconds. Let's see if he's online.
To me, which came through in all 3 theses and particularly came through in the first and third, is the need to humanize our cities. Our cities are nothing if they're not going to be fit, or they're not going to be suitable, or they're not going to be places where human beings, and not just human beings, but human beings first, at least human beings, can have fulfilling, enriching, satisfying existences. So it goes back to the notion of what is a good life and well-being, right? So if we use well-being, if we use ideas around well-being and ideas around humanization, Prachita was very nice to see that in Delhi is a very classist city. Perhaps in no other city in India will you find the kind of class differentiation that you will find in Delhi, and the kind of reinforcement of that class distinction. You will not find that in any other city. It's one of the uglier aspects of, I'm a Delhiite too. I used to be a Delhiite, so I'm happy that Prachita actually challenged that by saying that, where are the vendors going to go? So in that sense, I want to congratulate you. I'm very happy that we have refocused our attention to those essential aspects of city making, city building, place making, that bring quality, that bring experience, experiential richness to our city. And I think Mangesh put it very well in his comments, and I think that that's what I have to say. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you both of you for your wonderful comments. Do you have any specific questions to any of our presenters this evening, Mangesh or Saurabh? Or
well, I don't have a question, but I would like to compliment obviously there is at least Sushant is a new program, and it's very satisfying to see quality thesis coming out of Sushant. So very happy to be able to, and some of the mentors I have not in CEPT I have not met, but it's evident that they've pushed a kind of quality that is remarkable. So very good work for all 3 of you, and in particular Prasanna, your work was outstanding. Very nice. Very happy with your work too.
Thank you, sir.
As presenters, if you would, sorry, yes, go ahead.
Just to conclude, I think all 3 of them, the kind of work they have, produced, it speaks of both planning strategies also and design-based, interventions. In our entire exercise, what's going to be important for all of us is the process. And if you do this process very well, like deep analysis, deeper analytical understanding of all those issues, anything in the world you can manage, any type of project, right? So I think today what we saw was the kind of deep process that you'll have gone through, right from your issues related to macro to micro. And I can see that a lot of you all have touched about issues related to softscape, seasons, biodiversity, ecology, but it's very important to go with the time. For me, if I go to see, landscape never remains the same. The canal, what Abhinaya mentioned, is 1,000 years old. So 1,000 years old, maybe the palette was completely different. Okay, 15th century, maybe it was different. In today's date, there are maybe different challenges to handling that canal. The hydrology pattern has completely changed. So I think we as landscape architects have to put that layer of time over our design proposals. The whole link of the historic connections of the past on one side and the technological challenges on the other side in today's date to make it sustainable or to make it resilient is the biggest challenge for us as landscape architects. Whether it is a village, ward, or a hamlet, or a town, or a city, you'll realize that it's the kind of thing which goes on changing at different levels. But for you, it's very important to understand and go with the time of the land use, time of the infrastructural challenges. As of now, you see the decentralization process is happening, which we never thought of. Reverse migration is also happening. So, accordingly, what happens in Abhinaya's project, what we saw, it was completely integrated landscapes. Unlike Prachita, where it was gated community kind of thing in terms of securities and things like that. So I think you should go with the time and see how you can handle. And on the other side, Prasanna is trying to introduce a grid over your entire landscapes. So I think it's very interesting to see the alertness of our analysis into landscape design and put them in the process. The moment that is done, you will design for the time. I'm sure we as landscape architects, it's a big struggle for us to get to the industry in making them understand these layers that you have just explained, but it is not impossible, right? All the best to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Prasanna, Abhinaya, Prachita, any final thoughts that you would like to share? We have comments from Dhanya. She says that she absolutely agrees with Saurabh's comments on the addressal of common spaces. And Rishi also says, shares his acknowledgement. Any final thoughts from the presenters? Well, okay. So I think what was very interesting for me was a thesis, or if you look at the word thesis itself, it comes from the same word as theorem, theory. So basically it's an inquiry. And all three of you had wonderful inquiries. From Abhinaya, I felt that you were touching at an entire history of 1,000 years and trying to bring that forward and sort of plugging that into today's context. In case of Prachita, she really tried to understand how the Qutub complex exists, and it revived some of my memories, taking for an hour and a half on one occasion when I really wanted to rush somewhere at that Mehroli Gurgaon Road and Aurobindo Marg junction. That signal was my God, and I'm surprised that it's still like that. But yeah, I mean, touching aspect of traffic and people moving and mobility and everything in a context of historical precinct was also very interesting. And in case of Prasanna, in grid seems very geometric, very structured, and then in the context of landscape, when you perceive it, it's quite interesting and refreshing to see. So all these three theses, personally, there's a great takeaway for me, and I think thesis open day has been always like that it allows us to disconnect from our otherwise practice, which is very structured and boring, and we look at things too practically. So it allows us to kind of get away from that and relook at the profession in a completely different spirit. So thank you, both the panel members, Mangesh and Saurabh, for joining in. Thank you, Prasanna, Abhinaya, and Prachita. And thank you all for staying on a Friday evening when we have overshot clearly by about 21 minutes. So tomorrow again at 6 o'clock in the evening, we have another session, which is wildlife habitat. We have 3 other presenters, and we look forward to all of you to joining back in. Rashmi, to you, and then we can conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. That was indeed a very engaging session. Thank you, participants, for participating and presenting your works. Thank you, Mangesh sir and Saurabh Pokle sir. So I would like to close today's session, requesting everyone to log in tomorrow for tomorrow's session called Wildlife Habitat Session. Thank you.
Rashmi, just quickly, the login ID remains the same for tomorrow's
No, we're
session.
going to be resending the login IDs at 4 o'clock as usual.
Yep. So all the viewers, please please check your emails and log in accordingly. Thank you all and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Oh, left.
Not
Yeah,
yet.
Dilip.
Just about another 10 participants. I think 6. Thank you, Shantesh, for today's session.
Most welcome. Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure to have you.
I don't see Dilip. Where is he speaking from? Isola, Bangladesh.
Yes. Dilip, can you
Yeah.
remove the participants so we can go ahead?
Just a second. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, Shantesh also left, is it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I wanted him to be there. Anyways, it's okay. Dilip, okay.
Yeah. Just
How
can
do-
you will log out and log in again?
Yeah,
It'll be
same
easier
ID,
for me.
na?
I'll give you an ID.
Okay, done, done.
I'll just create an ID because this again shouldn't go back.
Okay, done.
Okay, 2 minutes.